After being off on summer holidays for a little bit, I'm back making YouTube videos. And this one I'm doing a timber frame style above ground flower planter. Sadly, my pool also turned green while I was on holidays, which is too bad because it's super hot while I'm building this thing. It is the Wild Kingdom over here, so I'm going to try and tame this up a little bit and put in a decent looking flower planter, turning this into something that looks a little bit more like that. For this I'm using 6x6s, and then obviously I've got a planter for the big tree, a planter for the small tree on the right, and then a flower garden in the center, or vegetable garden, whatever people want to use it for. First thing I'm going to do, obviously clean up the area a little bit, rake up all the organics that are kicking around, and then I thought this tree was actually growing through my fence from my neighbor's side. Maybe it's on my side, I'm not sure. Anyway, cut that down because it's just a sort of a weed version of a tree, and get rid of that. Basically turn all the area nice and flat and get it ready to go here. So just off camera, I did dig a bit of a trench around the garden to delineate where I want this thing, and I just rolled a 6x6 in there to get warmed up and to show you where it is. And I dug that hole maybe 2 inches, 2.5 inches deep kind of thing, and tried to keep it level. I did not rip out the big roots for the trees. Obviously I would probably kill the tree if I cut out all the roots. And there's one on the back left hand side as well. So I am going to work around some of the root systems that are already existing, but that's what it looks like. And all the links for my tools and stuff are going to be in the description. I've got a whole bunch of 6x6, circular saw obviously, I got some crushed gravel to go underneath things, some landscaping cloth, I got a chop saw. Again, the blades are too small. I do have a square, I got some cut and seal, a hammer, a level. I've got a large steel square. I picked up a large chisel, that's pretty key. These screws are 4 3/4 and they are pressure treated, certified. Paintbrush, a couple more levels, some gloves, Hearing Pro, Eye Pro, that kind of stuff. I got a shovel and I got a rake obviously. Probably the most useful tool was the chisel. If you have larger saws, those would be helpful as well. Obviously I'm using tape measures and stuff, but the rafter square was probably the most important tool out of all the tools I used in this. Now the sort of left to right length on this thing is about 17 feet, maybe 17 feet 3 inches, and I add 5.5 inches because obviously the 6x6s overlap and they are 5.5 inches in width. So I do add a bit of extra length, and really I'm only measuring on the bottom row. Everything above that I'm not really using a tape measure anymore, and I'll show that in a bit. And for this chop saw, the blade isn't big enough to actually cut through the 6x6, so I have to take 3 cuts at this thing. So if you have the right tools, it'll go much faster, it'll be much easier, but just because I didn't have the correct tools for the job, it definitely added a lot of time to this whole process. Basically all of my saws are too small to cut through 6x6s in one chop, or to actually notch out the 6x6 for the timber frame style. So anyway, 3 chops, that's how I cut it out. Now to notch out this 5.5 inch chunk here, you can see the width on these are 5.5 inches using the square, and then I just measure back 5.5 inches. So really I'm just cutting this thing straight in half, 5.5 inches back. So that's 2 3/4 all around, 5.5 inches back. Now this circular saw also is not big enough. Normally it's set the depth of the circular saw to the depth you want it cut, and then you just chisel it out. Circular saw is only going to go down about 2 inches. Obviously I needed to get to 2 3/4 of an inch. So I'll make a whole bunch of cuts with the circular saw so that I can make it easier for chiseling it out, but it's not going to get deep enough obviously on this first pass. So I do things a little bit differently. I got everything in fast motion obviously, but for this first one I'm sort of trial and error how I'm going to do this with the circular saw. So I don't want to go and buy larger tools just to make a flower bed, but obviously to notch this out I just used the circular saw, made a bunch of cuts, took the hammer and then smashed out all those cuts, and then I just smooth it all off with the chisel. Now this is the only one I do like this. I change my style in a little bit here. This is sort of where I had an aha moment and decided I would have to do things differently or I would be wasting way too much time. So I will show, obviously this is the failed technique, but if you had the saw that's large enough, you could just set it to the correct depth and then just do this, which would be much faster. But obviously if you have the smaller circular saw like I do, you may have to find alternate means to get through this thing. And what I ultimately do is use the circular saw from 3 different angles. So for this one, I measure that 2 3/4 with the square, and then I come back over it with the circular saw. But for every single other one after this, I don't do it this way. So just on the first one, while I'm doing a little bit of trial and error here, I do it this way. And then for all future ones, I cut through the side first. Because once you make that cut, obviously your saw loses a bit of stability. So I found it just better to do this side cut first. I'll show that later. But like I said, this is the first one. And halfway through the process, I decided that I should probably do it differently to expedite the time it's going to take me to make all these notches for this flower planter. And then I use the chisel to smooth everything out and break all the pieces off and just make it nice, neat, and fairly square so that all the wood pieces fit together fairly reasonably. You don't have to be too accurate. You're not building cabinets here, but obviously you want to get it as close to perfect as you can, keeping in mind that these 6x6s are twisted and not exactly 100% straight. Anyway, once I got the 6x6 notched out properly, I do take cut and seal, and every time I make that cut, I seal it up with cut and seal. I do find the cut and seal is a bit runny, but I do come over everything at the end and paint everything down with cut and seal. Now I've got the bottom done. It's got both ends notched out just like I did on that first one, and then I had to cut a big chunk out for those roots. So I do put in landscaping cloth. I think this is pretty supplementary. Didn't really have to happen, but I do it anyway. I went and paid $30 for landscaping cloth, so I throw that in the hole first, and then I'm gonna come in with some of that gravel that I bought and throw that on the bottom as well, and that way the wood's not sitting directly on, I don't think it's clay, but not, so it's not sitting directly on the dirt. Even though these are rated for on grade or slightly below grade, they will be fine. Obviously it's a treated 6x6, it'll last a while. I do put gravel underneath them, and then I do come back around later and put gravel around them as well. So now tossing these things in the hole, and just by the way, this does take a few days to get this whole project done. Obviously, like I said, it's super hot out, and it just takes a while to make all these notches in the boards. And I did find also with that 1/2 inch of gravel on the bottom, you can just sort of slide the board back and forth a little bit. It'll even out the gravel, and it'll sit a little bit flatter and fill in all the dead spots where, you know, pushing it back and forth on the dirt might not actually fill in those dead spots. But with gravel underneath it, it does fill in those hollows. So obviously throw the level on it, make sure it's looking pretty good. And then I will take the second 6x6 and drop it in the hole. Obviously everything's already pre-notched out. And same thing, drop it in the hole, push it back and forth a little bit, push the gravel around, and make sure that it's sitting where I want it to sit. You can see right there where I notched it out, it is high enough that the roots will not impact the flower planter, and I would say there is space for the roots to move. And then just checking it out on the level, you can see it's looking pretty good. Obviously it's a flower planter, it doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but ideally it will be as close to level as you can get it, keeping in mind, you know, what it is and what it's for. Now I'm using those 4 3/4 inch screws, and they have to go through half of a 6x6 and into the other ones. So really a 4-inch one would probably work, but I used a little bit larger one. Coming back the next day, I'm gonna do the side pieces, and there is no back on this. I may come around later and put a 2x10 across the back, but there's a fence back there. There's no requirement for it to be 6x6s all around, and that'd be pretty expensive. So it is about 30 inches in depth, and obviously, like I said, about 17 feet in width. So these smaller pieces are much easier to cut. If you can get away with using smaller 6x6s if you're doing sort of a timber frame style, that'd probably be ideal. I found the 12-foot pieces were pretty cumbersome to move around by yourself, especially when trying to use this chop saw. I did get one 16-footer, and that was absolutely brutal to move around yourself and try to line up on the chop saw. Now just to show you how I notch all of the boards other than the first one. Again, I make that 5.5 inch mark, and I do that on 3 sides, and then I take the square again and mark out the 2 3/4, which should be right in half. And I do that on what would be the left and right side of the board, or what eventually will be left and right side. So again, really just using that square, and I use that a lot. And I also put the 2 3/4 mark on the front of the board as well. And that is for a guide for when I go to chisel out the center of this thing. So like I said, I do cut it at 2 3/4 inch first. So when I did it the first time, I did not make this cut. But after having that experience on the first one, I decided it is much better to do those side cuts first. And then I cut it right along that 5.5 inch line to delineate the furthest cut that I need to make. And then after that, just make a whole bunch of cuts in between the 5.5 inch line and sort of the end of the board. Then I grab the hammer and chisel, do some smacking and smack out all those pieces, and then take the chisel. Obviously, usually there's a stubborn piece or there's a knot or something like that. Having the chisel really does help quite a bit. And then I flip the board on its end. Again, the saw is not big enough to make it to the middle of it, and then I just take the chisel and smash it straight down. And that does a pretty good job. Not 100% perfect, but pretty good. And then I just take the chisel and I chisel out the imperfections. Because you don't see the center of this thing once it's actually installed, I do end up scooping the center out a little bit. It's really just the edges that have to be sort of flat and square. If you scoop it out in the middle, not a big deal. And then dropping it into the hole, it's going to look like that. Obviously, I dug the holes back, put a little bit of gravel and landscaping cloth in as well. And there we go. The first side is looking fairly level. And then I'll come over to what will be the left side of this thing and drop that one in. It's a little bit shorter because I'm avoiding that root, and it is also looking pretty level. Again, they didn't go in level the first time. I had to throw in a bit of gravel and just level it off with the gravel, which I found also very helpful because the gravel is just easier to move around than dirt, I found. Others may have a different opinion. And for this first row, I use the square on all of these things, but after I get going, I don't use the square anymore because obviously I'm just going off the first board, and if the first board's square, everything above it should be squares, as long as all the boards that are on top of it are lined up. For the first row, I do use 4 screws. I end up using 2 screws once I get a little bit further in to the project on the second and third course of this thing, but definitely for the first row, I use a few more screws than I do later. And because I'm making boxes around the trees, I now have to dig it out. And this is the first box about 30 inches in width. I dig this one out where I want it. And I have marked out on the front facing 6x6 where I want that 6x6 is going to go back towards the fence to go. And I just take that circular saw again, make a whole bunch of cuts. Obviously it's 5.5 inches in width. For this one, I do cheat a little bit because this one is right over top of where those roots are, so I don't actually make it full depth. So there's an important note on this, but it doesn't really matter because once I backfill it with dirt, you can't really tell that it's not quite as deep as the other ones. So I actually notch out on the other 6x6 a little bit more to compensate for that depth, but not really important. It's sort of a specific to my situation. And I did have to do a bit of extra cutting because I did find that there was some more roots back there once I actually dug out the dirt. So I do have to compensate for more roots on this one. So this is a bit of an abnormal board, and it took a little bit more trial and error just to get it to fit based on all of the roots in that area. And to secure it, I'm just using 4 screws, just like the other boards on the bottom. So 4 of those structural screws. And coming through here, you can see this is a vegetable garden. There's not really flowers in here now, but it could be used for something else. Tomatoes are coming in. And I've already dug the trench for this 6x6 and notched it out and dropped in the landscaping cloth. Again, I think that landscaping cloth is pretty sort of a supplementary item to this, but I will throw that board in there. It's already been notched out and it looks good. Not all the boards go in easily. Some of them are pretty difficult with knots and stuff, and those were the worst ones to notch out. And then I do take all of the remaining gravel. I did buy 3 bags of it. I think they're 66-pound bags or something like that. I just sprinkled it all around the bottom. And again, just to keep the dirt away from the boards and hopefully improve drainage. Now, after about 2 days, I got 3 rows of this done. I used the cut and seal wherever I slam some screws in, and I did get some 6.5-inch screws as well, just to go through the entire 6x6 and into the one below it periodically, though I do mainly rely on the smaller screws. Now, to measure everything off, like I said, I don't really use a tape measure. I use that square just because I can just drop the board on there, take the square, and mark off where I need to cut it. And I just found that was easier than messing around with tape measures. Now for notching out the forward facing 6x6, again, I take that square to mark out where I'm going to make that cut. And I'll show you a little bit closer with the camera here how I did that. I just slide that square along the top board until it hits the one underneath it. And then basically that's where that mark is. And then I do the same thing on the other side, slide it across the top until it hits that board that's underneath it. And then I just make that mark. And that's where I'm going to come across with the circular saw. Now again, this needs to be at a depth of 2 3/4 inch. So the circular saw doesn't actually make it that deep. However, for this I use a second circular saw. I've got a really small one. It's like a plunge saw, which I bought for cutting out some flooring once, but I found it does a pretty good job and it's gonna let me cut the rest of the way. So after using my regular circular saw, I come in with the chisel, knock all that out, just like I did before. And obviously this is gonna be a little bit different because it's right in the middle of the board. So it is more difficult, but it's not much more difficult. And for this one that I actually recorded, it has a ton of knots in it, so it was actually pretty brutal. Nothing fancy here, just take the chisel and try and get that notch as flat as possible before moving on to the smaller circular saw, which is I guess a plunge circular saw. And I just make as many cuts as I can with the smaller circular saw, and it has a depth setting. So I think the depth I set it at was like 5/8 of an inch. Basically whatever it took to bring me down to that 2 3/4 inch point. And then I do take a handsaw and cut down the same distance with the handsaw on each of the far edges, because obviously that little plunge circular saw doesn't get right to the edges. And then after I do that, I take the chisel and the hammer and I just break away all those pieces just like I did after using the circular saw. This is a little bit time consuming, but I didn't have any problems with it. Every single one came out fine the first try. I didn't have to, throw away any boards or anything like that. So pretty easy. I'm no expert with the chisel. I'm no timber framing pro here, so I was able to do it without messing up any boards. I'm sure you can do it as well. But that's the method I use to do it, using just basic everyday tools and not buying special tools to do this 6x6 timber framing. And as far as notching the other piece of wood, same thing as all the other ones. Nothing special to that. And it fits in just like that. So pretty time consuming, I would say, when you don't have the right tools, but definitely still achievable. And you can come up with a product that looks like this. I think it looks pretty good. It looks a lot better than it did. And I'm gonna do a stone or brick patio. So I wanted to get that flower planter in place because it's gonna be the left-hand edge, if you're standing at the house, of my actual stone patio. So I needed something there, and obviously this flower planter is gonna be the thing. It's also gonna serve as a bench. And you can see I was a little bit more careful with the screws on the top of this thing, and I did take cut and seal and I painted the entire thing with it, just to try and get a more uniform look, because I did get a lot of cut and seal all over the place. It's a very runny product. You can see some runs on the front of this thing, which I'm not too happy about, but it's not a big deal. I'm hoping that as the weather sort of weathers the wood, those cut and seal lines will disappear. I'm also planning on using some Thompson's water seal or something like that on this to seal it up, but I'm gonna let everything dry. And after I finish this thing, it became a little bit rainy, so I'm gonna have to wait to do a final seal on this thing. Anyway, fairly time consuming, but overall I think it looks pretty good. Thanks for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.